quite often talking to advisors, as I do day to day, it's quite noticeable there's certain trends at certain points in time, and some conversations are tougher than others. So I thought we might go through almost a couple of scenarios that I could put to you, and perhaps for each of those, you can outline a brief structure, some points to be aware of.
Yep.
So the first one is we're coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
A lot of advisors going into COVID, they were unable to see their clients as frequently as they usually would.
Yep.
They probably haven't had conversations with them about lifting fees for 2, 3, 4 years.
Yep.
In some instances. Now, this, of course, in today's environment, and we know the cost of living pressures, it's the same for advisors. Fees need to rise over time. It's a tough conversation, Johnny.
Yep.
And there's lots of different objections that clients will come up with when the advisor's having that conversation. You know, I might pause first and see if there's some things that you want to share with us just on that initial part.
Yep.
And then I can give you some of the typical objections that might come up.
The first thing that comes to mind is, and we might cover this on the way through, but there's 4 techniques on handle objections. Now, our experience is that 95% of people use one technique, but that's the wrong technique most of the time. And so we use it because that's the one that we know, and the other 3 take a bit of work and practice to get used to. So I think that it's important. So there's multiple ways of handling it, and it's not a matrix where that objection equals that. And that's, often we say this to people, that's why a good advisor is worth their weight, because you need to have the intelligence of being able to think on your feet enough to actually work out a situation, assess it, and react accordingly.
Yes.
You're not sitting there managing money like a boff and not talking to anyone. You are literally the person who's the conduit between the market, what's going on out there, and the client. So that ability to communicate has to be as strong as an expertise as your ability to understand insurance, investments, and all those things.
Agreed.
Second thing is, people make decisions. People often talk about rationally or emotionally, and we say, no, it's rationally and emotionally. So often we make it emotionally and we justify it with logic. And so when we are building a position or overcoming an objection, we need to make sure that we're covering the emotive element behind it. And you're talking about raising fees whilst interest rates, post-COVID, all those things out there, that is emotive.
Yes, it is.
And that will often override the rational. So you've got to make sure that you're covering both. The final piece I just want to really touch on is that I feel like, and I don't want to make this like I'm stereotyping at all, but if there's some advisors who have felt a bit beaten up over the past few years, I think that's really fair. But what it often does, it impacts the confidence to have these conversations that they may not have wanted to have 5 years, been able to have 5 years ago or 3 years ago. And so...
And I would go as far to say that advisors don't like raising fees. I mean, they obviously don't want to charge their clients more, but it's a simple fact. It needs to happen.
100%. Yeah. And I think you got to know your worth. And then with any conversation like raising fees, there is a risk that you will lose someone. And I had this conversation with an advisor actually on Tuesday, and he said to me, no, it was Monday, he said, you've got this client that's questioning their fee, and we've changed the model and they've put more money in. And I just, I think it's a bit unfair. And I looked at the fee difference, and we're talking like 3 times the fee in this new approach of doing it. And I thought, well, that's really fair, because they were happy with the previous service. You've changed the way that service and the model and so on out there. And I'm not saying it's not good value because they were underpaying before, but also just the human beings having a conversation with you. Don't take it as you're not worth it and take it personally. Take it as, okay, well, we need to have a conversation around it. Because someone who, this particular client had $2.5 million invested, plus their insurances, plus this, plus strategy advice and so on, like that's a really critical part of their life. And what they're paying towards it every year is actually quite a minimal amount to what they're getting. But that's okay to have a conversation about it.
Yeah. The client that would say, in the face of that conversation, the client that would put up the objection, or perhaps say, well, look, rather than put up the fees, why don't I just come back and see you and pay you on an hourly basis when I feel like I need you? How would you approach that?
I would have a conversation where, again, think rationally and emotionally through this. Is I'd have a conversation around it. And I might quickly touch on these 4 techniques.
Of course, yeah.
One is this idea of acknowledge and explore. Tell me, why do you think having it a few hours is going to be more beneficial? Why do you think what outcome do you think you'll get from that? What do you think you'll lose out of it? So whilst you're using questioning, the problem with acknowledge and explore is you are making the problem bigger in a lot of cases. They might have just thrown it out there. Well, why can't I do this? And you just start asking and asking, and they go, actually, yeah, no, I think this really would work. And it starts becoming a bigger problem than it was. So sometimes it works, but a lot of times it makes it worse. The other one is actually, we call it acknowledge and ignore. Now, some people can find this a bit rude, and it's not meant to be. It used to just be called ignore, but people used to literally start ignoring people. So we had to stop that. Right? Imagine we're having a conversation, I just start turning away. But it's acknowledge, and I say, you completely understand that you might be thinking that. Do you mind if we quickly just explore a couple of investment options and then we'll come back to the investment side? And so we've acknowledged it, but we're not even covering whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. We're just not covering it. I don't want to handle it till I've built value. So what I might find is by handling it, I make it a big problem. By not handling it, and then we start building value, tell me again about what your goals are. Oh, well, I want to retire by the age of 65 and I want to be able to travel and I want to be able to do this. Okay, so tell me, whilst traveling, what's going to be important for you? I just want to really soak things in. Great. So now I'm putting my solution in and saying, here's the option here, which means we put you in a position where you've got a higher likelihood of being able to retire properly, the ability to travel without even thinking about this. And so we're positioning where we're actually putting
it's not
there.
Even a question anymore
No.
after you do that. Yeah.
Now, if it comes up again, you can say, what happens when you're traveling? What happens, if we got to the end of 65 and you weren't there, right, and you had to work an extra 3 years, but it saved you $3,000 a year, talk to me, like how are we feeling at that point? So you can start handling it then if you want to, but I wouldn't do that. So that's number 2. Number 3 is what we call explore the opposite. So where we might actually say, money aside, if this fitted in directly to a number that you were really happy with, what's the next most important thing when it comes to this service for you? And we're trying to take their mind away from it being about money. Because the silly thing is, it is about money because we're investing their money. But whether it's 0.5%, 1%, whether it's a set fee, in most years, the return is significantly higher than that if you're good at what you do. And so therefore, they focus on the little bit they're not getting, not the big bit that they are getting. And so we want them to come down to, okay, so service is important. Great. Are you happy with the service that we've got? Yeah, great. What else is important to you? Oh, I just get the sleep at night factor, or that my family's across it. Great. Do you feel like we've got that? And so you're sort of exploring the opposite rather than dealing with that there and then. And what you'll notice with all these techniques, apart from acknowledge and explore, it's to avoid us going against each other.
Yes.
Right? Because if you're saying I'm not worth the fee and I'm saying I am worth the fee,
it becomes confrontational.
We've just positioned ourselves on different sides of the argument.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do is get us on the same side of the argument. And the final one is, how would you solve it? So put simply, someone keeps coming back to the fee. If I believe that was the best way forward for you, I'd straight away put that in front of you. But the markets are dynamic. The markets have proven this in the last 3 years more than I think any other time in history, through a war, through COVID, through inflation, through interest rate rise, all these things that have been going on. The markets have never been more volatile. And we look at it 24/7. We have research houses that are looking at this on our behalf. We get funds that come to us that have been pre-vetted, pre-looked at, and then we make a decision based on everything that you've got. We can't do that 2 hours a year, right? To achieve the outcomes you got. So you tell me, how would you like to see this solved?
Yeah.
And so we reiterate the value proposition and then we ask them to do it.
I want to move into another scenario that is quite common and is becoming more prominent. We have an aging population.
Yep.
We've got, or advisors have a ton of clients that are getting older and older.
Yep.
The big challenge for them is that at some point there is going to be an intergenerational wealth transfer. So how do we get to know, as an advisor, the sons and daughters of our clients? Because clearly, if we can retain that business over time, that's hugely beneficial. How do we embed those relationships? How do we build that rapport? Where do we go?
I think for advisors, because they get to see so many people's scenarios, they should never underestimate their expertise. And that expertise to be able to meet someone, understand them, and develop a financial, investment, insurance strategy that meets their goals. And so I think we all would say, certainly if I'd started earlier, I'd be in a better position. And I met an advisor, a planner who was my neighbour at work, who tried to get me in at 25 when I had a business that was going really well. And it just sounded boring, if I'm honest. He just kind of talked about, 45 years from now or 40 years, I'd be in a position where, and I was like, 40 years, it's forever away. By then I'll be fine. And so the reason I'm bringing this context up is, at what point do you start engaging? And I think you can engage for a number of reasons. One is, it could be, as your parents are moving through this, it'd be great to, get you across where your parents are. Or the other aspect is holding some form of event in the office or hiring a space around education around investments and what to do, right? And in that, talk about liquidity events that come up and what to do, talking around different things, because, property is such an obvious one. And so talking about, asset allocation, and property is one of the great investments. We believe in it, but we believe it should be X amount of percent of an asset allocation of a diversified investment strategy. And so I think it's holding events is a good one. I think it's just having open conversations, which is, what's the purpose, what like your goals for investing? And it could be to leave a legacy of some sort. So great. Who would that legacy before?
I think that fact of acknowledging that those clients may have a huge interest in property, because many of those, 20-somethings, 30-somethings are going to be looking for their first property. So I think to acknowledge that rather than just ignore it, I think that's a great thing to do.
Which we do too often sometimes. Like, we think of it as taking money off us and so on. And the good advisors don't. I'm sure most don't that are here. But I even spoke to an advisor and was doing some coaching, and they are an investment advisor, so which I know is different to it's not all advisors we're speaking to with that. But I remember they had a client who had a really large sum, like $6 or $7 million with an advisor, met them at an event, kept chatting and said, I'm going to give you 700 grand in cash that I've got. And this other advisor had them invested in Aussie equities only. And they said, so we're going to do the same. And I think if we can outperform over a period of time. I said, but what's the win in that? And I said, why don't you actually have a conversation around investment strategy, asset allocation, and actually have a conversation where you say to them, we're not going to go head to head because we don't believe any model I've ever seen in the world says that we should be 100% Aussie equities. In fact, that number is getting less and less and less. Over time, we're going to suggest that you start pulling that across. Now, in a good market, we're not going to outperform them. In a bad market, we probably will because of the risk that you're taking. But what we're going to do is we're going to take this $700,000, and because you've already owned a lot of Australian property, we're going to put it across global equities, fixed income, alternatives, et cetera, right? And then kept having conversations about asset allocation, kept educating. Then they moved to 1.5, 2.2. Now they're roughly $3 million of that. And so slowly, by having that just genuinely real conversation, and I think the right one to have.
Absolutely.
I'm not an investment advisor, but that was my advice to them as an investment advisor. So I think it's having those conversations where, we've been educating you, but we know you've got kids. And while they may not have the same level of you for investment, just letting you know, we'd be really happy to educate them at no charge, in that approach. And again, comes back to what we said earlier, thinking about the business you want 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And so start cultivating that piece of business there that you might be getting. And I also think about this, that whilst, accumulators or people in their 30s maybe not paying the same level of fee as someone in their 40s or 50s or 60s, they will one day, and they don't probably want to be sitting with an advisor that often.
100%. The striking thing post-COVID is the change in the ability for people to communicate in different ways. Personally, I'd never heard of Zoom, prior to COVID. Very limited usage. We've got Zoom, we've got Teams, we've got all these other ways of communicating. Yeah. How can advisors leverage that to build these relationships with children, grandchildren of existing clients?
So one of the reasons why our business grew through COVID is when you try and organise, let's say this podcast, we need to get you to Sydney or me to Melbourne at a time that we both have availability for that to happen. We need to have a room with, the equipment, and we need you to be able to spend the time filming. I want Will from my team to be here as well. So we've got 4 people's diary. And whilst we might film for an hour or an hour and a half, we need to put aside 3 or 4 hours to make that happen.
Yes.
right? For us to jump on a Zoom like we've done a couple of times to sort of set this up, you probably don't need to have the, hey, how you going, as much as you will in person. We can all spend 20 minutes and fit it into our calendar because we're not driving anywhere, we're not driving back. And so one of the reasons it was so effective for me is I could have 9 training sessions in a day, or I could meet with the CEO and say, I could pull this together in a couple of days. What are you doing Wednesday? Have you got 15 minutes? And I'd chuck 15 minutes in the diary. And I found that little 15-minute, 20-minute catch-ups became really easy to get. So I got multiple more touch points than I ever would have had. But what I've found is now a lot of people don't want to meet on Zoom. They want to meet in person because we can. And we've seemed to have gone from one extreme now to the far extreme. And I would say that we have multiple mediums of contact, and we should be using the multiple mediums depending on the outcome we're looking to achieve.
Sure.
Right? You use text really well, right? Just to check in. You don't need to call me to see what time I'll arrive or to give me the address or those sorts of things, right? You send me a text, I go, yep, that's what he needs. Email is obviously there. To my clients in Asia, WhatsApp is huge. So trying to use different methods to be able to get connection and contact, the ability for you to be able to let your clients know what's going on with the world with one email, one note that put out there. So if you deal with accountants, sending it to some accountants and saying, if you're getting asked like we are, here's some talking points to consider. So again, it's finding that way of, we don't need to meet in person because that's what we've always done. We don't need to put an hour in the diary because that's what we've always done. Sometimes 20 minutes is fine, or 30 minutes, and mixing the blend of Zoom, text, whatever it is. How do we use all the different mediums? Because I know the likelihood of having 20 minutes for a Zoom is much higher than a 1 hour face-to-face. And so if you did 3 of those versus that 1 hour face-to-face that takes half an hour to get to and half an hour back, I would suggest those 320s are incredibly effective for some things, but maybe not building rapport in the first place or those sorts of things like it would be if you met in person.
It's a wonderful point. I think, we shouldn't be dismissive of the 10 or 15-minute meeting. It can be as powerful, as the hour-long meeting face-to-face if that's what the client wants. So I think it's wonderful just to remind people of that. So Johnny, our next really tough conversation.
Yep.
Letting a client go. It's not inevitable, but for a lot of advisor-client relationships, at some point, it will make sense that relationships run its course. The clients received a great deal of value, and we're at a point where maybe not much more can be done. It's they've been set on a course, and it's maybe in their best interests and potentially the advisors that things are separated. It's a really tough conversation. You've had this client for 20, 30, 40 years. How do we approach this conversation?
Yeah, I think pre-meeting prep's really critical. And so I think sometimes we use pre-meeting prep like only a sales environment, but it's any environment. The more prepared we are for a meeting, the better we can be present, and the more engaged and connected, and the better outcome we're going to get. So that's one. Number 2, and I think I don't need to say this, but just have the client's best interest at heart. If this is best for them, make sure it is best, and have an alternative for them.
Yeah, in the experiences I've seen, the advisors I've spoken to, that is the root cause. It's in the client's best interest.
Yeah, and so I think having that alternative of this is what I recommend that you do is really important, but then you just need total clarity. So because of the longevity of relationship, I want to ensure that we manage that process for you as easily as possible and get you set up. So there's 2 other options from here that we see, or any other option you want to take. Number 1 is you get set up on your own platform where you can just look after it, still use these investments of ETFs, et cetera, stick with the indexes and whatever it is. I'm not the investment advisor, I won't talk to that. The other option is you could find an advisor who works at more of a low-cost approach of being able to provide this. Unfortunately, our business doesn't have that scale because we've got the nice office, we've got lots of staff, we've got a lot of fixed costs that are there. And again, we just don't believe you're going to get value out of the X amount of thousand you're going to have to spend. And just having that conversation.
I'm guessing the ultimate preparation in that scenario would be perhaps having another advisor that you could refer to. making sure that the client had their login details, that they were set and well set up to look after themselves going forward if there was no advice required. That all comes back, I think, to that preparation point that you're talking about.
And practice. Because a lot of that is how you have the conversation. Now, I hadn't written that down, so I'm obviously making this up, so it's probably a bit messy. But what I'm not doing is leaving it up to choice. I'm not saying, if you want to stay, these are the options. What I'm saying is, we're not offering you value. We can't continue down this approach. And this is the alternative. These are the two alternatives. And we're going to help you through that transition process as best as possible. Right? We want you to be as comfortable through this as well. And just total clarity of that. Where we get ourselves into trouble. Yeah, look, you've got to understand as well that, we've got lots of clients and we've got, this and we've got to charge a set fee because, I need to get paid and I've got to pay my staff and I've got to pay this. And you're making it almost their problem.
Recipe for disaster.
Yeah, the more they're sitting there thinking to themselves, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just giving you a fee every year. Why am I in trouble for this?
Yeah.
And so really clear, empathetic in your style and your delivery and have an alternative for them to go. It doesn't mean an advisor. It could be a wrap platform. It could be a, whatever it is. I'm not going to mention wrap platform names. We're not in the world of
no names, Johnny.
of endorsing or anyone like that out there. Yeah, having an alternative of what they can do about it and what that means for them, I think is really important.
Yeah. These are all very salient points. I think there's a lot of common sense in here. I think you're bringing structure where structure's needed to conversations that sometimes can be difficult. I have put you on the spot a little bit today, so I thank you for being very generous with your time. Johnny Lee from Enable SE, thank you very much.
Cheers, Damon. Appreciate it. Thanks for everyone.